Martin Wolf, Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator, Financial Times, London. Rajdeep Sardesai, Consulting Editor, India Today Group. Ladies and gentlemen, after an intense discussion or sets of discussions on a whole host of topics, including the economics of COVID-19, the availability of vaccine or not, the impact on business, and a whole host of other issues, we are now going to discuss a subject which is important to all of us, which is what is this doing to the nations in the world, to the global relationships, and is it causing a new world order? For this important and interesting conversation, we have two outstanding experts here with us. We have the privilege to have Martin Wolf with us today. Martin is a recipient of the CBE, for his services to financial journalism. He's been a keen India watcher, and he frequently writes about economic and political developments in India and its neighborhood. Not always friendly to India, but he keeps an eye on India. And he makes sure that he's writing what he believes is the right view. We have an opportunity today to hear Martin's view directly ourselves here today. Martin, thank you very much for coming on board and welcome. You once famously remarked that in order to change the system, we need to change our ideas. We'd love to hear some of these ideas today, especially in context of India's equation with the world and its neighbor, with what's going on with this ultra-nationalism, especially this additional effort that's been kicked off by the vaccine and many countries wanting the vaccine for themselves and their people first. Rajdeep, in 2019, you published an interesting book. You said how Modi won the elections. I hope next year or the year after next, you'll be able to write a new book saying how India conquered the pandemic, at least in India. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. You've been a friend to AIMA. We have relied on you to conduct many sensitive political discussions for us. Thank you for joining. Ladies and gentlemen, India is currently battling on multiple fronts, as are many other countries. One is the battle against the disease, which is very global. Second is the battle against the economic slowdown and some fear a looming recession. And third is our borders currently under threat, or at least noise on our borders on both sides, east and west. Perhaps the COVID contagion has exposed predatory instincts of nations as well. They've turned suspicious of each other and aggressive towards each other, and a few dormant hostilities appear to have resurfaced. It'll be interesting to hear what Martin has to say, and to get the best out of Martin, we put the best of our foot forward from our journalism. Rajdeep, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Munjal, for that very kind introduction. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And yes, we are living in extremely unusual times. I think 2020, it goes without saying, has been a year quite like no other. The fact that we have now a pandemic which shows no signs of slowing down at the moment, certainly not in this country. We are adding 90,000 plus cases per day. The fact that we have a border situation with China of a kind that we haven't experienced in several decades. And the fact that we have an economy which in the first quarter has contracted by a humongous 23% clearly suggests that we face a three-pronged assault in this country. But it's not just India. The entire world order in a way has been disrupted by all that's happened in the last several months. And I think it's important to try and therefore locate India within this new world order or new world disorder, as we may call it. And maybe, Martin, that's where you could start off and tell us how you've seen 2020. I must tell the audience, Martin's just writing a major book at the moment on democratic capitalism. I can't think of a better time than to be writing a book on the crisis, some would say, of democratic capitalism. But at a time like this, with all these various challenges, COVID, China, the economy, locate for us how you see India and, more importantly, the world order in 2020, the tectonic changes. Try and make some sense of them for us. Over to you, Martin.
So thank you very, very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be participating in this discussion. I should say in the response to the opening remarks that I consider what I've written always to be extremely friendly towards India, and occasionally perhaps even a little too optimistic. But I will not go further on that. I'd like not just to focus on 2020 because it has to be set within a slightly longer historical context. I believe that we are in a hinge time in world history. And by its nature, that is a time when the future becomes particularly unpredictable. But at least we can, I think, identify the nature of this time. We are at the end of a Western-dominated and particularly US-dominated world, and with it, the end of the period of Western-led economic globalization. The former, the predominantly Western-dominated world, you could say has gone back centuries, many centuries, but was really reinforced after the Second World War, with the victory of the US in the World War, and the subsequent victory, of course, in the Cold War. So it reached its apogee in the 90s, arguably. Since then, two very, very big things have happened. The first big thing was the global financial crisis, which was both an economic and I think geopolitically incredibly important moment in terms of losing confidence in the West, confidence in itself and confidence of the world in it. And then, of course, COVID-19 coming really not very long after the global financial crisis, which in the whole, the West has not handled very well. And associated with these failures has been the rise of populist, right-wing populism in the West and its fragmentation. The West itself has fragmented, particularly in the Trump era. And the second huge transformation, of course, is the rise of China to becoming a superpower. With its enormous population and tremendous economic potential, it has the capacity to generate, though it isn't there yet, an economy at least as big as that of the US and Europe combined. And the COVID-19 crisis has crystallized all this in very, 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 very starkly now. And this is the world in which, and that's the sort of first major point I'm making, we are in a time of profound transition and breakdown. And a crucial part of that breakdown, in addition to the breakdown of the West itself, is, of course, the breakdown of relations between the US and China, which I think is permanent. It's not likely to revert under any government. And it reflects increasingly a strategic consensus within the US, rightly or wrongly, that China is, if not an enemy, a strategic opponent for the indefinite future. In this context, India has to decide what it wants to do. India has some degrees of freedom, has to decide what it wants to do. And there are essentially two things India, I believe, and I'll just leave with this, has to make up for its mind. First, what are its vital interests? And the vital interests are obviously prosperity and peace, it's security. And the second point I think it has to think about is how to achieve these. And in the context of prosperity, I think it remains the case as before, that in order to achieve prosperity, India needs its trade and investment relations with the rest of the world to grow. It needs an open world. It's not going to prosper all on its own. So that's the first huge question. What are India's interests? And then the second huge question is, what are its choices? What are its strategic choices? And I'll just end with sort of three alternatives. And I've got a lot more to say, but first option is to be neutral and to play both sides, which is more or less what India did during the Cold War, but famously so. It was non-aligned, more aligned with one side in some respects, less so in others, but basically non-aligned. The second possibility is to say China is the dominant regional power. Forming very close friendly relations with China is the dominant interest of India, because the US cannot be relied upon. Of course, the risk there is that China will become all dominant in Indian politics and its economy. And the third option is to go with the West, reduce relations, both strategic and economic, with China, accept the economic costs of doing that, and risk being dumped by a very unreliable US. Those seem to me the options. And my own view, for what it's worth, is that so long as is possible, India should try to play with both sides and remain, as so far as it can, non-aligned. This may be very difficult for it, and there are some very painful choices. But this is, I think, very roughly where we are and the sorts of choices India confronts.
Interesting, Martin, because some would say that the choices that we have been decided for us by the external situation. For example, the situation on the border, of a kind that we haven't witnessed in decades, clearly suggests that despite India reaching out to China, Prime Minister Modi investing a lot of his personal capital in a relationship with President Xi, it hasn't quite worked out. And therefore, India has no option but to look for alternatives to a closer relationship with China. We talk about the Quad, but there will be other relationships that India needs to develop, a stronger relationship with the US, which has been in the making now for more than 2 decades. Do you get a sense that, does India really have those choices? Or do most countries have those choices, given the fact that you're saying that you believe that there is a breakdown of relations between US and China, which will not be in any way reduced in the years ahead?
I think obviously that's a core question, and it partly relates to the extent of the breakdown between the West and China, and it depends also on the behavior of China. On your first point, I'll come to the extent of the breakdown in a moment. I don't know because I'm not there, whether the situation today on your border is now an irretrievable precursor to a major war. If it is, then obviously options essentially have disappeared. To an outsider, it doesn't yet look as though it's the irretrievable precursor of a major war, and that a modus vivendi might be reached. That's crucial. That's crucial. Obviously, if we are talking about a major war in the near future, then everything changes. And I would regard that as a true tragedy for all parties and an incomprehensible mistake by the Chinese. But that's the first question. So let's see how that unfolds. It's clearly true that close friendly relations with China will not emerge, but you don't need close friendly relations with countries to be able to trade with them. And that then gets to the first of my questions, but the second one I'm getting to, which is the nature of the breakdown between the West and China. It remains the case today that despite areas of trade, particularly in information technology, all aspects of information technology, where the breakdown economically between the West and China is deep and growing, that nonetheless, they remain profoundly entangled economies. There is an enormous amount of trade continuing to go on between Western countries and China across a vast range of activities on which they both rely, as well as a very large amount of investment. And this has not yet, nor has indeed even the Trump administration, tried to end it. It may happen that it will end, and that will certainly cause enormous economic disruption. because the interweaving is so great. It's the big difference between our relationship with China and the relationship with the former Soviet Union, which was essentially a security relationship. There was no economic relationship really between the West and the Soviet Union. There is a profound economic relationship between the West and China, and of course, a very profound economic relationship, even more profound, of many of China's neighbors with China. So for those countries, and there are lots of them, I've written a lot about this, being forced to choose between the two as economic partners will be a nightmare, real nightmare. And they are going to do everything in their power to avoid it. So the more optimistic view of what might unfold, which is, so we've got to one of the points I would make, is there will be a difficult geopolitical relations. A balancing exercise in geopolitics is what's going to happen, with an alliance, if you like, of countries trying to balance China, while economic relations continue to be quite close and vigorous. And there are a lot of countries, let me just mention a few: Japan, South Korea, actually Taiwan, not a country, an economy, Australia, New Zealand, all of ASEAN, who desperately need a security relations with the US and economic relations with China. And they will do everything they can, I think, to preserve both, because to lose the former is dangerous for their independence, and to lose the latter, their economic relations, is dangerous for their prosperity. And it's not where we are now. And I have to say, I hope it's not where we end up.
Because it's an interesting moment that we are at, where you've got China being more and more expansionist, more and more belligerent, led by a leader who obviously believes he has a sense of destiny about him. And you've got America, which is being led by, dare I say, a populist nationalist, who perhaps has a very different worldview, wherein America becomes much more inward looking. So you've got an inward looking America, talking about America first, and you've got China, which is determinedly expansionist, not just in the region, but also in Africa, in Latin America and other parts of the world, looking in a way to expand its influence. So, we seem to be in a peculiar moment in history. And in the pandemic, if you look at the pandemic, China is the economy that has recovered the fastest. The others are still struggling. So, you just wonder, how do you deal with the inscrutable Chinese on the one hand, and how do you deal with a Trump-led America on the other? Both unpredictable.
I suppose. Well, much with much of what you say, I agree. But it's not quite how I see things. So let's separate out the different elements. Mm-hmm. China is a rising power, absolutely no doubt. And it has what it sees as strategic interests, security interests, and it has economic interests. So its economic interests are global. Unlike the US, it's very important, China is not an economically self-sufficient economy. It requires enormous imports of raw materials. In many ways, I've made this parallel, it's not a natural one, but from an economic security point of view, it's more the way Britain was 120, 130 years ago than the US, because it's so trade dependent, import dependent. I mean, for example, all its iron ore comes from Australia. So it seems to me history would suggest, all of the last 200 years would suggest, that China is bound to be interested in furthering close ties, including infrastructure links, with countries which are important trading partners. And that's Africa, it's of course Southeast Asia, it's Central Asia, and to some degree Europe. And I don't really regard that as expansionist. I regard that as the natural development of all great economic powers in the modern world, and particularly the ones which are highly dependent on imports. It was really the driver behind the European empires of the late 19th century. Now, looking up from outside, it obviously looks expansionist, but the Chinese would see this as simply preserving their economic security. But it is something they're doing. their military forces, interestingly, unlike those of America, which has hundreds of bases, have actually moved back from where they were under Mao. They're not engaged in lots of wars abroad, which they used to be, and they're focusing on essentially their frontiers. That is generating friction across all their frontiers, with you, and of course with Japan and Taiwan, and so forth. Is that expansionist? Well, the Chinese view will say, no, we're just securing our frontiers. Securing your frontiers creates conflict throughout world history. It's absolutely, completely standard. And you just have to work out a modus vivendi of some kind. And I hope it doesn't lead to world wars, because it's going to blow up the planet. So that's China's side. It's becoming, in other words, so powerful that its expansionism and its attempts to secure its frontiers make everybody else frightened. And how we manage that, very interesting question. So that will require clearly some sort of alliance, a balancing alliance, a Kissingerian balancing alliance seems to be inevitable. Then that leads to the question of the US. Is it interested in doing that? Now, Trump has no strategic doctrine that is coherent. His administration seems to have two doctrines which are not consistent with each other. One doctrine is his, which is America first, very little foreign entanglements, but lots of rhetoric about the evil Chinese, particularly after COVID-19, because he thinks and wishes to suggest that they created COVID-19 deliberately in order to poison America and the world. And that's electoral politics. But I don't think there's any grand strategic aim here except remaining in power. And his instincts certainly are non-interventionist. The rest of his administration, and particularly his Secretary of State, has a strategic goal, which is indeed not merely to take on China and to form an alliance around it, but I think it's pretty clearly to achieve victory over China. That is to say, ultimately to destroy the Chinese regime. It's a Cold War objective, which is about as far from Trump's ambitions as anything can be. My own view is neither of these strategies make the slightest sense for the US, and we have to hope that somebody comes along who rejects both. That is to say, he does try to form a strategic alliance to balance China, while at the same time recognizing China will remain a very different power. It will remain a very great power, and it's a power, therefore, with which the US will have to cooperate over a very large range of issues. And that sort of strategic policy making in the US is at the moment nowhere to be seen. What they need is a new George Kennan, the man who designed the policy to constrain the Soviet Union, but it's not where we are now. So it's a strategic mess. The Chinese doctrine, on the other hand, is pretty clear and pretty natural. The question is how you contain and live with it.
You know, it's interesting you're speaking about so-called Trump doctrine, if one exists. There's, of course, the Chinese doctrine. And from an Indian perspective, there's the so-called Modi doctrine. Mm-hmm. You know, in the last few months, the Prime Minister has spoken about an Atmanirbhar Bharat, a self-reliant India, about, you know, make in India for India. An increased sense of protectionism at one level, even while talking about, you know, making India a sort of manufacturing hub, perhaps even replacing China at times for potential supply links, and standing up to the Chinese by saying we are banning TikTok, for example, and making that a sort of symbolic gesture against the Chinese. You ban 59 Chinese-based apps. I'm just wondering, you know, India itself, at one level becoming more and more protectionist and inward-looking and nationalist, and at the other level sort of, you know, trying to see if we can sort of look China in the eye. I just wonder where you see the rise of leaders like Mr. Modi, the sort of muscular leaders who sort of put, you know, an India first Atmanirbhar Bharat. Where do they fit in within this sort of new globalizing world? Is there a deglobalization that is inevitable almost now?
Well, as I already said, we're at the end of the Western-led globalization era, and we've already seen that in the data. Trade growth, though it hasn't collapsed until COVID-19, which we think might be temporary, but trade growth has slowed relative to GDP growth. In finance too, there are exceptions, but important parts of finance have shrunk relative to GDP. We are in a, I tend to say globalization isn't dead, but at the very least, it's sort of dormant. It's sleeping. Now, that's the economics. The politics are very much as you describe. I've written in my book, I've just been writing a chapter on democracy, and I say there are basically three systems of governance in the world at the moment. And there are some countries that are in transition. There's traditional liberal democracy, which is certainly still the politics of Europe. To some degree, though it's unique of Japan, obviously places like Australia, New Zealand, and in America we don't know, but I would say for the moment it's still a liberal democracy. There's what I call communist capitalism, and that's basically China and Vietnam, much less important. And then there's demagogic autocratic capitalism, a nationalist usually, and that's become a very powerful element of the political and economic universe, with small countries like Orban's Hungary and big countries like Russia under Putin and Turkey under Erdogan. And it looks to an outsider that India is moving from the liberal democratic camp to this camp. Is that durable? I have no idea. But that's how it looks. And this is a rising element. Bolsonaro's Brazil is another example, by the way, of this. And so this is a dominant thing. Now, my own view in my book is the evidence we have is that the economies of liberal democracies do reasonably well if they're reasonably well disciplined. They're rich, reasonably stable, not perfectly so, reasonably successful. And it has to be said that the communist bureaucratic capitalism has been astonishingly successful. They are very well governed. They have first-rate bureaucracies. The throttling of COVID-19 in Vietnam and China is staggering. And the economy is recovering. So that looks pretty impressive. At the moment, I would say, what I call demagogic autocratic capitalism doesn't work very well. Turkey is not doing very well. Putin's Russia is an economic disaster. Bolsonaro's Brazil is a disaster, and I'm rather disappointed, if I may say so, with India. Now, so the key question you ask is if that is where India is going, I can't really comment on Indian politics beyond this, then the question is, will India be run well? The biggest questions about that, as you know, 90% is how well it's run domestically, how well the system works domestically. But there are very important international aspects of this. My own view is that history has revealed very, very clearly, and I believe correctly, that self-reliance is not a viable economic strategy for India at this moment in time. It might be 20, 30 years from now when its economy is 7 or 8 times as big. If it is, it will be big enough to be self-reliant. But at the moment, India needs a lot of trade and a lot of foreign investment and a lot of exchange with other countries. So I believe its interests, at least economically, are not to go back to self-reliance. I think that was a mistake in the 70s. I wrote about that at the time, and I think it's a mistake now. Somehow you have to combine not having self-reliance economically, being engaged with the world economically, while achieving security from a geostrategic point of view. And that's precisely the set of dilemmas you confront. Now, let me make one footnote on the economic self-reliance. I think in general, the India needs to remain open. But there are some really big choices here, which you seem already to be making, which are become part of the Western-led regulatory and technology system, or the Chinese-led technology system. It seems pretty clear that India is right now making the choices to go for the former. That fits in with this strategic relationship, which is evolving on the security side. But there are risks involved in that, and it will have costs, but it might well be the right way to go. There are some choices that will have to be made, but I would emphasize my point. I think it would be a profound mistake for India to try to go back fully to the self-reliance model of 40 years ago.
Very interesting you're saying that, because straight after this is a session with a minister, I'm told, in the government, who's going to sort of push the idea of an Atmanirbhar Bharat, the self-reliant India. I just wonder whether it's just coinage, or whether it means much more than that. That at one level, that's for the populist political rhetoric at home, but the reality is very different. And we really, as you said, cannot go back to the 1970s. But the fact is that while you cannot go back to the 70s, perhaps the rise of, as I said, these sort of powerful demagogues almost pushes you at times to take certain decisions. We saw it with demonetization a few years ago, and possibly there's a sense that a country like India, at the moment run by a very strong government, perhaps believes that its time has come. And therefore, wants to fast forward itself into the high table of the world, and that's where a lot of these impulses are coming from.
I understand it fully. I understand the motivation, but the reality is this: to the extent that India has a bigger place in the world now than it did 30 years ago, it's because its economy grew really very quickly, very fast for 30 years. Everything hinges on the growth of the economy. India is still vastly short of its potential as an economy. It's a much bigger economy relatively than it was, but it's nowhere near being an autonomous superpower. So if that is the aim, that India wishes to be a great presence in the world, perfectly reasonable ambition for a country of its size, then the dominant means, 95% of the means, is developing the economy as quickly as possible. The Chinese showed, they've changed their minds now, I think it's a mistake, but that's a separate matter, that the way to do that is by exploiting openness ruthlessly. The Chinese exploited openness ruthlessly. It was the big difference between them and the Soviet Union. And in my view, the Indian economy is roughly where China was 20, 25 years ago or so, and it still has a very weak manufacturing sector. India must follow the Chinese example, and so far as it can, exploit openness ruthlessly and intelligently, making up for its weaknesses, which are substantial, through international exchange. This is going to be more difficult than it would otherwise have been in this very difficult international environment. I accept that. But if you go back to this sort of view that India is already there, it doesn't really matter how deeply engaged into the world. Protectionism isn't really a cost and so forth. I believe it will be proved by history that that's a very profound mistake in terms of your own objective of becoming a very major power in the world. It failed with the Soviet Union. It failed with India up to the 80s. It failed with Mao. It's why they rejected it. You have to embrace the world. It's just become much more difficult to do so because the world has become such a messy place, as we've been discussing.
So is that the disappointment you mentioned in between? I heard you're disappointed in a way with the trajectory that India has taken in the last few months. Is that where your disappointment stems from? Is this a 2020 disappointment, or something that's been lingering over the last few years?
I think it's been obvious to our intelligent observers, nearly all of whom are Indians, and you know who they are. So I follow their work, but lots of very intelligent Indian observers some abroad, some working in India, whom I know and trust, that the Indian economy has been slowing very substantially long before COVID-19. It had some very serious structural problems. I've written about some of them, again, based overwhelmingly on the work of Indian economists, who are, after all, first rate. And then COVID-19 came along and gave you a tremendous bash. And now there's this geostrategic nightmare, which is another potential bash. So I am very concerned that the mixture of an already very serious slowdown with very deep problems in your private sector, which are obvious, plus this massive global COVID-19 shock, plus the geostrategic breakdown, which we are perceiving, will push India down, and the policy options that you've been talking about will together push India back down to what, not completely, but what used to be called the Hindu rate of economic growth. Let's say now, not 3%, 4 or 5.
4 or 5%.
4 or 5%. Well, that will mean enduring poverty for far more Indians, which will be a disaster, and of course, immense postponement and delay in achieving the geostrategic objectives. So in my view, as I said, the primary strategic interest of India is to get the peace it needs to pursue the path of prosperity, which we know will involve very substantial integration with and successful competition in the world economy, and an effort to make that and keep it as open as is possible in these very difficult times. But I do hope that because that's why it's such a problem. It's not just the last year. It's many more years. You might even go back to 2012, 2011 or earlier. But clearly that's where we now are, in my view, in India.
So you think India actually at this moment should perhaps use the fact that the world itself finds itself through a process of fragmentation, through a process of uncertainty, use this time to try and go out to the world and build fresh alliances, then whether it could be to the east or whether it could be to the west. Because as we've seen in recent times, we've been reluctant to sort of cement those global alliances, especially to the east. You're saying this is a great moment for India, or at least a moment for India, to rethink and far from being protectionist, just do the opposite.
I think it's got a vital interest in openness, and it's got to exploit it as far as it possibly can. Whether that's possible with China under this leadership, and I'm just as disturbed by the way the Chinese leadership is going as many others, I don't know. But to say this is a very nasty and difficult world, as they decided in the 50s, that's exactly what they decided, and the way to develop is just to rely on ourselves, that was a profound mistake then, and I think it will be a profound mistake now. Exploit all the opportunities that are available. They might not be as good as you want, but I'm sure they will be greater than just relying on your own economy, your own strengths. India needs to be part of this world if it's going to prosper and succeed, and not go back to this isolationist approach. I cannot believe that it will make this mistake, but the weaknesses in the Indian economy that have been revealed are sufficient to make these sorts of choices more urgent than they were even a few years ago.
So do you see opportunities though in this COVID world? Do you see opportunities for countries like India at the moment? What are those opportunities and what are the threats?
Well, I hope that COVID won't be with us forever. We are going to go back to something close to normal. I think that if we are going to see more confrontation between the West and China, then India is a very natural partner for the West. And that will give India huge opportunities if it wants to exploit them. And I also, and by the West, I include here, of course, countries like Japan, close ally of yours. So huge proportion of the world economy. That's still the biggest part of the world economy is the Western system today. So that's huge opportunities. And I think you should not close the door on China. I think there remain, for China itself and for you, very powerful interests in engagement, accommodation, commerce. But of course, this has to be done in a way that preserves the security of both sides and the self-respect of both sides. But I think there are huge opportunities for India because it's a partner that other countries want to have. India is a significant player in the world, and it's a partner other countries want to have, particularly at the moment, Western countries.
We've just got 30 seconds, Martin. Someone put a question to me here saying, who's going to be better for India come November, Trump or a Biden administration? I guess who's going to be better for the world is the question being asked.
Well, I find Trump completely frightening because he's so strategically and morally unhinged. But I actually think the forces driving the United States to become close to India are completely bipartisan and overwhelming. When the United States looks around the world in this very difficult strategic context, which is so different, it needs allies it trusts and respects, and India is obviously one of them. So there are, and that will be true with Biden, and it will be true with Trump. There will be no difference in this respect. So from this point of view, go with it either way. From a global point of view, I think Biden will be able to reestablish a Western coherence, which is impossible under Trump. And I believe we deal with China much better united than we deal with it when we're fragmented.
Martin Wolf, it's been a pleasure talking to you. You've given us a worldview, which is very rare that we get to hear in India. And wonderful to know about your book. Look forward to reading Democratic Capitalism and its Crisis. You're going back right to the Greeks. So from the Greeks to the Chinese from the Greeks to the Americans under Trump is a very long journey to have traversed. So thank you very much for sparing the time. And thank you everyone who's been listening in. This has been fascinating to get an international outlook to this new world order or disorder, as we call it. Thanks very much, Martin. Thank you again.
A great pleasure. Thank you very much. And I wish you all the very best.
Thank you.